Technology is making more and more possible. The pace of change may make it seem that there is little we can learn from the past to understand the future. My name is Mike Von Masso, and this is the Food Focus Podcast. My guest this episode would argue that there is much to learn from the past to better understand the future. Will Wright is an animal historian at Augustana University. We talk about how our understanding and introduction of gene editing can be informed by the history of our relationship with domesticated animals. I wouldn't have thought that there would be much interesting insight relevant to contemporary issues, but like me, I expect you will find there really is. This won't be the last historian on this podcast. Well, Will, welcome. Good to see you again. It's been a while, and thank you for taking the time to have this discussion.
Great to join you.
So, Will, I have to be honest that when I started a podcast, I was not 100% sure that I would ever have a historian on to talk about food. But having worked with you and seen some of your work and seen presentations from you, I think there's some real value. But why should we look at history to learn about food?
Well, I think, one of the points that why looking to the past matters is sort of a reminder that the food that we produce, process, consume doesn't happen in a social bubble, that it's sort of shaped by politics, economics, cultural values, and that those things change over time. And so a historian is really interested in looking at continuity and change over time. And so just as an example, Nick Colither has this book called The Hungry World, and he looks how Cold War geopolitics shape food systems. So whether it's the Mexican agricultural program and Norman Borlaug working on hybrid varieties of wheat, or the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, they're deploying these crops for, in some ways, ideological reasons, to provide kind of an ideological barrier to sort of red China during the 1950s and 60s. And so they're exporting into places like India, Pakistan, Vietnam. And one of the famous quotes of that book that I think always sticks with me is a staffer in the Lyndon B. Johnson administration says, "Rice is as valuable as bullets." And it sort of hammers home this point that, food, it can be ideological. And so revisiting how value systems are shaping food in the past, I think, helps us to understand kind of the current value systems and how they shape food in the present and possibly the future as well.
Yeah, and I wouldn't frankly have thought that sort of one of the motivations of the Green Revolution and sort of the dramatic growth in productivity in agriculture was sort of to put up a bulwark against the spread of communism. But that might have been one of the reasons. Well, as you suggest, is one of the reasons that Green Revolution happened, and may have affected sort of investments in research and development and investments in plant breeding that might not otherwise have happened to that degree in the absence of that geopolitical environment.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So what sorts of things do we look for in the past to help us understand the future?
Well, I'm an animal historian, and so I'm really interested in humans' relationships to animals and how those change over time. And so one of the things that I do in my research is looking at specific traits in animals and how those traits, whether it be rates of growth or horns or muscle power, how those shape animal bodies, and then how different human societies valued certain things about the animals and how that changes over time. And so that's something that we look at and usually employ a very human-centered archive. So we're looking at, state documents or journals or things of that nature and saying, well, what can we know about this pig or this cow from this very sort of human-centered perspective? and how does that reveal kind of things that people thought about and tried to change about that animal.
Okay, so let's maybe bring this back to a more specific or focused perspective, and that might help people understand a little bit what we're talking about. You've recently done some work as a part of a project that we're both working
Mm-hmm.
on looking at the past and acceptance of genetic technologies in the past, really to try and gain some insight looking forward uh, relative to how we might uh, how the acceptance of gene editing technology might be accepted. What sort of
Mm-hmm.
things do you look for, sort of in the past, to help us do that?
Yeah, so what we did is we reviewed systematically about 120 works in animal history, and we tried to synthesize this body of knowledge and say, well, what are the value systems that are driving uh, uh, animals that we would consume as food? And what we found is that sort of not surprisingly, is that those value systems change over time. So in the agro-pastoral period, which we defined as sort of earliest times to about 1700, that these value systems that were shaping the animal were quite broad. So for example, in Ottoman Egypt, for example, in the 14 and 1500s, they used water buffaloes for all sorts of purposes, not just sustenance, right? So it was dredging irrigation canals or for ceremonial purposes. And so, because there are multiple pressures on that animal, it's not just for food that they're doing it. It has a broad suite of traits that are preserved in that animal. If we talk about a shift in about 1700, we start to see a much more singular focus on the values that are driving animal traits, particularly about sort of production. So if we think about, this is a time where the world is starting to industrialize and factory production is becoming more commonplace. And so just as products are starting to become more standardized, we're also seeing animal bodies become more standardized. This is where you get actual, what we'd call improved breeds, like Herefords, like Holsteins. And so we see sort of a shift there. And Robert Bakewell, who's an English tenant farmer, really introduced a system of breed improvement through using inbreeding. And then, sort of in the post-World War II or Second World War period, 1945 to the present, we see a sort of shift again where we see states very invested in shaping animals for food security, right? If we think about this sort of global warfare, sort of really shaking up food systems and a lot of rationing going on, so they're really concerned, and that sort of doesn't matter across the ideological spectrum. But then we also see citizens who are concerned about things like, animal welfare. Ruth Harrison in 1964 publishes Animal Machines, trying to think about what is the care and conditions under which things like chickens or cows are raised under. And so we also see societal concerns. And so it's, in some ways, we kind of go for a full circle in that value systems were quite broad in this early period. They narrowed around production and then have kind of broadened again. And so this is one of the things that we looked at by sort of tracking animal traits and value systems over time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think if you look, as you said, in the early days, uh, while there were a broader set of criteria, that criteria were all focused around productivity. We just had a diversified set of applications, if you will.
Yeah,
Then we
yeah.
said, okay, we're gonna focus. We're gonna have Holsteins for milk, Herefords for beef, and then the focus became producing as much milk or as much beef as we could out of those animals. So we're now broadening the criteria that we're looking at, but
Mm-hmm.
but we're moving away from productivity criteria uh, to a set of criteria that might create some tension in some of these breed selection, welfare versus productivity, and welfare being the big one, but also the healthfulness potentially of those products
Yeah.
is part of what's driving that sort of an increase in incomes and productivity and a move away, so that we have, frankly, the luxury to think about other things than just productivity, or what do you think might be driving that?
In some ways, I feel like it might be, and driven by sort of a consumer base that has more disposable income. But I also think part of it has to do with we have fewer and fewer people who are actually engaged in sort of agricultural production itself. So, you can go back to, the 1920s and 30s as a time where, a majority of society is directly involved in the food system, in primary production, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're growing crops, raising animals. And if you sort of change to sort of maybe 1970s, 80s, right? That population is shrinking. And so I think in some ways it's a desire to still be involved in that food system
Mm-hmm.
when people are not directly involved in ways that they would have been in the past. And so that's where I think kind of the having a say in the food system, why that matters is because the sort of less and less people are in primary production than they were sort of 50 years ago.
And that makes a ton of sense, and it also sort of contextualizes perhaps how we should think about engaging with people who are expressing concerns. That understanding those motivations better may help us sort of communicate with them in ways that may lead to more productive discussions.
Yeah, and in some ways, that's why one of the lessons that we drew after this history review was that, any technology that can meet a broader set of values, whether that's production or welfare or sustainability, has a better chance, if you will, to be accepted because it's meeting in some ways a broader constituency of people, and because less people are involved and more people want a say. I think that sort of lesson is only embodied if we look back to the past and say, what values, what ethics are shaping our food system.
Okay, that makes a ton of sense. So I'm going to pick some specific examples out of the paper, and I will post a link to the paper when we post the podcast for those that want to go take a look. And one of the gene editing characteristics that you discuss in the paper and was part of our project was the ability to select cattle or enhance cattle, the slick gene, for heat tolerance. And we have made efforts to improve heat tolerance in cattle in the past that I hadn't thought about.
Yeah, so in some ways, I look to the history of acclimatizing cattle to new environments. So
Yeah.
if you think about a lot of the improved breeds, right? Take Hereford, for example. Hereford, the name itself comes from the place that breed was developed,
Yeah.
which was Herefordshire, England, right? And
Yeah.
so this is a temperate adapted breed. And so in the 1700s, sort of in 1800s and 1900s, you have the expansion of a lot of these temperate adaptive breeds and spreading out all over the globe, from the Canadian prairies in, Alberta and
Yeah.
Saskatchewan to the Rio de la Plata region of Argentina. And a lot of breeders are having questions of like, how will this temperate adapted breed function in a tropical or semi-tropical environment in the case of South America? And in some ways that's provides sort of the pushback of like, will this breed be hardy enough to
Yeah.
survive warmer places? And in many ways, their answer is, as a purebred animal, it's not going to. And so
Yeah.
they import zebu genetics from India because it's known for its short hair coat and similar to the
Yeah.
slick gene. And so it's these hybrid animals that are zebu Hereford crosses that become sort of the standard bearer. And so one of the lessons, I guess, is that acclimatizing cattle was in some ways bound up in questions of empire, because
Hmm.
these were often French uh, or British or American companies that were exporting these cattle, and and so their motivation was not just to introduce a new species, but also to get a colonial stakehold in these places. And so we need, in some ways, need to think about the cultural context in which these genetic technologies operate. So the barriers that might be exist in a place like Canada might be different from a place like Brazil,
Yeah.
where it has this history of um, thinking about cattle in this sort of imperial context. And so that's, again, animals don't happen in a bubble. And
Yeah.
so we need to be thinking about these broader societal forces that are shaping the food system in that case.
Yeah, and specifically to heat tolerance, I think you talked about expanding it, sort of. You could argue perhaps food security in some of these countries, the introduction of proteins, but also then the dependence on sort of imported technologies.
Yeah,
We're talking about the slick genes specifically in the context of building resilience to climate change.
yeah,
But I think there are some lessons from the past that we might have some unintended effects. In fact, broadening the area where we can produce cattle, and perhaps leading to things like clearing of rainforest and other things where we're expanding. Is that a fair?
yeah. So yeah, that's a fair assessment. Not only thinking about, okay, are we adapting these cattle to perform just as well or better in what more weather extremes, but also thinking about what's the geographic footprint of this animal, and are we enhancing certain traits so that they can survive in a broader range of conditions that would lead to things like deforestation in the Amazon. And so these are, by revisiting this history, these are things that kind of are on the forefront of our attention when we think about the policies, the ethics around these technologies. A good example that I think really highlights how food security became a big value, not only in the post-war era, but I would say still today, is the collaboration between Canada and Cuba when it came to dairy production. So after the 1959 revolution with Fidel Castro, he really wanted to enhance the domestic milk supply so that each Cuban child could have 1 liter of nationally produced milk, and end a reliance on US imports for that milk. And so Cuba actually turned, so we had a communist country turning to Canada to import Holsteins and to have Cuban veterinarians that would train in Canada so that they could open up artificial insemination centers so that they could transform their largely zebu herds into zebu Holstein hybrids that would have more milk production. And by the 1980s, Cuba is the sixth largest dairy producer in all of Latin America, largely because of these. And so it's just a great example of how, kind of across ideologies and political spectrums, you have two countries collaborating on kind of shared goals of trying to enhance food security in both of those countries.
And it may, looking back, been one of the drivers of the growth in the Canadian dairy genetics industry, right? Was
Yeah, yeah. A famous example is Hanover Hill Starbuck, who was a famous stud bull uh, owned by CAIQ,
Yeah.
um, out of Quebec. And yeah, his bull semen was basically exported, I think it's something like 20,000 straws to 46 different countries across the world. And so if we look at the value of food security, we can see why that genetic stock would have such value,
Hmm.
across the world in some ways, and explain why Holsteins are everywhere, right? You
Yeah.
can't go anywhere, any continent, and not see a Holstein. And
Yeah.
so you have to turn to history to understand that.
Another topic you cover in the paper is dehorning and welfare, and the evolution of that process. Uh, what what do you think was interesting at looking at the past of the process and practice of dehorning?
So when we revisit the past, we see that, in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, that horns really had value. And it was because of how they were raised under open range ranching conditions, because they provided a means of predator defense. So whether it was wolves or jaguars, right, in the absence of human handlers, you wanted an animal who had horns. Otherwise, that animal could be uh, a predator's snack. And so it's not until we see the rise of railroads and these large slaughterhouses where animals are much more in concentrated areas, whether it's at a railhead or at a slaughterhouse, that we see kind of this issue of animals goring each other as they're in close proximity to one another actually being an issue. And so this is the very moment when the practice of dehorning actually occurs, first in Ireland in the 1870s, and then we see this practice sort of adopted in other countries, including the United States and Canada, in the 1880s. Um, and this is so interesting in that this is where disbudding enters the picture,
Yep.
because there are people within the Royal Society Against the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals who are lobbying governments and saying this dehorning that we're doing to prevent goring is actually causing unnecessary pain to the animal.
Yep.
And so they outlaw the practice. And there's actually a farmer in Ontario who's arrested
Yeah.
for dehorning his cattle in 1892. And so this commission is formed in 1893, the Ontario government commissions, and they recommend the practice of disbudding during calfhood because they say the wounds heal faster, it's a less invasive process. Um, and so this is where sort of disbudding gets first introduced as a practice. And so we see that in some ways these same arguments happening for gene editing,
Yep.
that one of the reasons why, from a welfare perspective, we can eliminate pain altogether if we produce a genetically hornless animal.
Yep.
And so in some ways that debate originates from the 1890s, right? And we're still having it, new technology, but same debate. But my point about talking about horns in the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s is that, there could be a time where horns have value again, right? There is more and more pressure on food systems to raise animals extensively rather
Yep.
than intensively. And that could produce a market force where you have more open range conditions. And in that case, right, with, wolves in Canada, for example,
Yeah.
right, that there may be a time where horns have value once more. And so we should also not limit ourselves in saying that if we want to eliminate horns, right, it could have these sort of broader consequences for how this food system develops.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I think we often get stuck in the now when we're making some of these decisions in sort of the contemporary environment. And I hadn't you know, I understand why dehorning or disbudding or gene editing to raise hornless cattle makes sense in the current environment, but I hadn't thought about it in the context of why that became valid, right? You know, we feedlots, dairy animals in barns,
Mm-hmm.
and and thinking about moving forward, well, with some of the pressure to perhaps go, as you say, more extensively, may change that, and perhaps thinking in anticipation of what some of those things might be one of the most important lessons we can learn from history, is the motivation for some of these changes that we don't think about if we're focused on the here and now.
Yeah, yeah. In some ways, the value of history is providing this longitudinal perspective, right?
Yeah.
And kind of in providing a longer perspective, we see that in some ways the choices in front of us are much more open than we might think. You know, that there's only these narrow set of circumstances that we need to adopt certain things or go certain directions.
Yeah, it makes me think. It maybe it's out of context. It makes me think a little bit about the quote from Henry Ford, which said, "Well, if we'd asked consumers, they'd have asked for a faster horse instead of a car." And sort of thinking about a broader range of opportunities and potential eventualities, I think, is important. I've kept you about as long as I promised I would. I want to give you a chance to sort of to make any points that I should have asked you about, but was remiss and didn't. Is there any other lessons that you think are worth sort of highlighting here?
Well, I mean, I think one thing to end on is looking at sort of recent history, right? And looking at transgenic techniques that developed in the 1980s and 90s, and how, you know, things like recombinant bovine somatotropin, or RBST, and in some ways the contestation that happened around that technology was a result of not consulting people,
Yeah.
right? We talked about less and less people being part of the food system, but wanting more and more of a say. And so to avoid, you know, some of the pushback, I think is bringing in kind of a broader array of voices, and again showing that this food system has multiple values at play, right? And whenever a technology can have more values that it meets, the more likely it is, whether that be gene editing or something else, to be uh, accepted and adopted. So yeah, I think the recent history matters too, to why we're trying to revisit the past as
Yeah,
well.
and yeah, and understanding some of that pushback, the fact that to a degree we inflicted that technology on the public
Yeah,
rather than engaged that public. And so again, a lesson might be, let's have a more fulsome discussion rather than a student once said to me, a conversation can't be two monologues, and that's
yeah,
often where
exactly.
we end up, is that level of engagement. I think that's an excellent point, and I thank you for making it. So, well, that was really interesting, and I apologize for not thinking that a historian could create value on a podcast about food. I think it's been fascinating. I learned something in addition to when we've had previous conversations. So thank you for taking the time.
Well, there's a growing amount of food historians and animal historians, so hopefully it's not the last.
Okay, good. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Food Focus podcast. We strive to find topics of interest and relevance to people passionate about agriculture and food. If you have any suggestions, please visit us at foodfocusguelph.ca and leave a suggestion. We also have regular blog posts on the website you will find interesting. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to leave a review wherever you get your episodes, the website, Apple, Spotify, or many other platforms. We appreciate your reviews and it helps others find us. Stay tuned for more episodes.